I just wanted to welcome you formally to our retreat. It's a funny kind of retreat that's 6 blocks from the Capitol and 10 blocks from the White House, but we've moved from introspection toward engagement with these programs. And I think a lot of the theme is located in the search for the next generation of policy innovation at New America. You'll see that tomorrow's agenda is very much set up in a workshop style to try to identify challenges for ourselves as staff, as fellows, as an institution for the year ahead, and to sort of reset ourselves intellectually about what matters and what we should be working on. If this is located in this search for policy innovation, it's a narrative in 2 parts. Today is analytical and tomorrow is solutions and engineering, and a lot of what we're trying to do this afternoon is to think about where strategic surprise is coming from for policymakers in Washington and to really wrestle with some of the hard questions. And the first of those is the economy and jobs. And for that, I'll turn it over to Michael. Thank you all very much for being here. I look forward to more over the next 2 days. Do you need it?
No.
Great.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everybody to this first panel, which is what is wrong and right with the recovery. I'm Michael Lind. I'm the policy director of the Economic Growth Program. To help us analyze what's going on in the economy, we have 3 of the most insightful experts on the subject I know. We have my colleague, Cheryl Schwinninger, director of the Economic Growth Program. We have Mike Mandel, former chief economist of Business Week and founder of Visible Economy. And we have Lenny Mendoza, director of firm knowledge at the McKinsey Global Institute. To get directly into it, we'll begin with Cheryl.
What I'm going to do is present in a very abridged version of that handout that you have on your seats, what was called What's Wrong and Right with This Recovery. And essentially I'm going to address or lay out some initial ideas on 2 questions. First, how transformative has it begun, or is it laying a foundation, new foundation for economic growth as President Obama's principal goal of his economic recovery program? 2, is it how sustainable? Will it withstand the future headwinds and eventual withdrawal of government support and enormous stimulus? Now, on the positive side, let me generally characterize my answer to the first question. It is that we've taken a few baby steps towards transforming the economy, but at best, they're transforming. Again, my presentation is providing just a abridged version of that much longer document. On the positive side, we see the continuation of rapid productivity growth. In fact, in the first quarter from 2009 to 2010, we experienced 6.3% productivity growth, which is the largest gain since 1962, I believe. We also, on the positive side, see some strength in CapEx spending in industrial production, suggesting that business investment is coming back at an earlier stage than we might have expected. Capital spending on equipment and software has been particularly strong, with a 13.4% annual rate in the first quarter of 2010, which is on top of a 19% pickup in the fourth quarter 2009. Less positive, however, and suggesting perhaps we aren't changing much the structure of the economy, is that we're still far too dependent on consumer spending. Now, I know Mike Mindell has some questions about the BEA statistics in here, but as the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, calculates that consumer spending actually hit, as a percentage of GDP, actually hit an all-time high early in 2010 at 71%. Also somewhat worrying that we still have a lopsided recovery. We have surging profits but very stagnant wages. Nominal wage growth is now only 1.6% year over year from April 2009 to 2010. Also somewhat negative is the fact that of those corporate profits, still a disproportionate amount is related to financial profits. And so while it's down a little bit, financial profits still account for about 36% of all domestic corporate profits. And much of that financial profits comes from proprietary trading. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley had nearly half of, or more of their income revenues gains coming from trading. Also somewhat negative is the fact that after some encouraging improvement, the savings again, our personal savings are again on the decline, and has stood at 2.7% in March. Now, the trade deficit is also increasing again, partly, and it's going to increase more as the dollar rises and economic growth in America's largest trade partners begins to slow, especially Europe. And in fact, exports now are subtracting about 0.6% from GDP. Now, I would argue that in fact, policy has worked. In spite of the goal of a transforming the economy, what we have is that the policy has given us the results that you would expect. We had a gigantic monetary reflation with the Fed more than doubling the balance sheet and slashing interest rates. And we had a fairly large Wall Street bailout. And therefore, we did have the recovery of financial assets and profits. We did have a fairly aggressive tax cuts, cash for clunkers and unemployment insurance, and we've had the temporary support of consumer spending. And we also, on somewhat more negative side, modest infrastructure spending and public works spending, modest relative to the either side, and we've had essentially weak job growth and stagnant wages. Now, is it sustainable? And I would argue not yet. We have, on the one hand, one-off inventory gains, which will be one-off if final demand does not materialize. And in fact, real final sales is running historically much behind the historical levels of real final sales. Secondly, consumer spending, which is at an all-time high in terms as a percentage of GDP, is actually on life support. That nearly a fifth of the personal income is now made up or comes from government transfer payments, unemployment insurance, et cetera. And so if you took out transfer payments, we'd have a very, very small boost in incomes over this period. Plus, now we're facing, or continue to face, a number of serious headwinds. The debt overhang. Deleveraging of the private household and financial sector has barely begun. We've just made a very modest, if you see that huge increase, then we've had just a modest contraction of credit and lowering of debt. Meanwhile, government debt has begun to increase dramatically. So we still have an enormous debt overhang. We have continued housing woes with a very large shadow inventory, and which many experts believe will again depress prices as we move into the summer and fall. We have state and local government fiscal crisis that are coming to the fore. Over $200 billion of shortfalls, or nearly $200 billion expected. Already state government cutbacks are subtracting from GDP growth, and they will do so more in the future. And just when we didn't need it, we're getting serious global headwinds. The Euro crisis, which the EU accounts for 21% of US goods exports, an even larger share of corporate profits. It also accounts for the largest share of China's exports. So this is going to slow demand or reduce demand for both China and the United States. A rising dollar is going to put a further crimp on our competitiveness and may short-circuit manufacturing. And now we have both Japan and China putting renewed emphasis on exports. Japan has taken a policy of trying to reduce the value of the yen over the last 3 or 4 months successfully. China is running into trouble in the sense of having to try to control credit and may have to turn to exports in the future. And we have a very worrying general world picture where we still are awash in excess capacity. And as we see, because of overcapacity and the new Western debt crisis coming on, we have the increased resurfacing of deflationary pressures, which is all, unfortunately, spells some difficult news for the United States because the U.S. may find it much more difficult to expand net exports and export its way to a sustainable recovery. In fact, we may be facing again that age-old dilemma of having to absorb the excess capacity of other economies or face the possibility of a prolonged world economic slowdown if the current recovery doesn't hold. I've included some questions, some very prescient questions that Lenny Mendoza asked at our jobs symposium back in October, and also some, if you need some questions to ask us, there's some more questions on the last page. And I'll turn it over to Michael Mandel.
Thank you, Sean.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's just make sure that my presentation is up first. Are they getting it up? Oh, terrific. Okay, I'm about to take on the quixotic task, especially on a warm Washington afternoon, of trying to convince you that, that there are problems with the economic data that are so deep that they're actually distorting not just our policies, but our politics as well. And let me just start off by explaining. We swim in a sea of economic data, much of it produced just a few blocks from here. Whether or not you're a numbers person, the data frames the daily conversation. It frames the discussion about which issues are important, which issues aren't. And it frames the policies, whether we think the policies work and whether we think we don't. And so if there are problems with the data, they have profound implications, as we saw in the financial crisis. Because what we had in the financial crisis was, in retrospect, the dismaying sight of Ben Bernanke in early 2008, when the avalanche was already in motion, explaining quite carefully to Congress that the problems were containable because the bank capital ratios were still good. Okay, and he was very sure about that, and a lot of other people were very sure about that too. And if you go back and you look at the data, they still look good, even at banks that no longer exist. Okay, and what I want to do is in a very short time here, okay, and you'll yell if I've gone over my time, right, Michael? Okay, he's going to yell at me if I go over my time. Okay, good. What I want to make the case here is that there's a disconnect, okay, between some of the statistics that Shirl was citing in his very good overview, okay, and the deep anger that a lot of people are feeling, and that we have an obligation to kind of reconcile this, and there are some ways to reconcile this. Leo Hindery has been persistent in illuminating the problems with the unemployment statistics, but the truth is that there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. And I want people to sort of take a quick look at this chart, okay, which comes right out of the BAA, and it's what they call the domestic product of goods. And what it shows is this very interesting chart that, in fact, this economy, which we all agree is having problems, is in fact, according to the BAA, at an all-time high in goods production. I have not done anything to these numbers. I have, nothing is up my sleeve here. This comes, in fact, comes right out of table 1.2.6, okay? All right, okay, keep that in mind. You are living in an economy where goods production is doing just fine. All right, here's another table. This compares productivity growth over the past 10 years, which I call the decade of the aughts, since nobody else seems to have come up with a good title yet, with the previous 5 decades of the post-war era, And lo and behold, what you see is according to, this is once again published economic statistics, according to published economic statistics, this was the best decade for productivity growth on record. Are you feeling better now? No, I didn't think so. Okay. Then we have export growth. This is over the past 10 years. The top purple, the top deep blue line is export growth in real terms. The bottom is, pink one is import growth. And lo and behold, what you see is over the past 10 years, according to the government numbers, is that exports have grown faster than imports. And what goes along with that, okay, is that red line is the size of the trade deficit in real terms according to the government. And what we see is that the trade deficit today is the same size in real terms according to the official statistics as it was in 2000. Okay, and now these are the numbers we all live and die by. Okay, they are what lies underneath the numbers that Cheryl was talking about. You hear pretty much, as people probably know, Business Week was brought up by Bloomberg in early December, and we came to an amicable parting. But one of the things that it left me with is that I listen to Bloomberg Radio now, okay, which is, as my son says, is kind of soporific. But they do a lot of economics, and what I hear there is I hear these economic numbers being cited all the time. And what's interesting is that if you believe the official statistics, they have certain implications that bear directly on policy. First implication is that the 33% decline in manufacturing jobs since 2000 has nothing to do with trade. It can't have anything to do with trade because the real trade gap has shrunk. It's only logical. Okay? There's no negative impact of trade. Therefore, if you have falling manufacturing employment, it must be because of productivity. Second implication is that U.S. workers today are 34% more productive than they were in 2000. And the policy implication is that any weakness in real wages must be due to income inequality and healthcare costs. Okay? And the third implication is that the U.S. is the industrial base to export itself out of trouble, which bears on President Obama's pledge to generate new jobs by doubling exports in a fairly short time period. Okay. Now, what do the official stats tell us about the recovery? They tell us that things are all cheery. They tell us that exports are rising faster than imports. They tell us that productivity, as you say, is up 6.3%, and they tell us that real consumer spending in the aggregate has reached an all-time high. When I wrote about this on my blog, I sort of talked about this as data from an alternative universe. Okay? Now, I want to just say a few words here about what we don't know, because what it really turns out here is that the economy has changed. The economy has changed from being nationally based, from being goods and services based, to being focused on tangible investment. It's changed to be an economy which is about globe-spanning supply chains, about intangibles, intangible investments as being the key. Okay? Knowledge, not so much goods and services, but knowledge is the key. So that what we have here is an economy that we simply are not tracking correctly. And here's what we would need to know in order to be able to give, how much time do I have left? Okay. Here's what we need, part of what we would need to know in order to be able to give good policy suggestions at this point. Let's start with exports first. Exports in the data are tracked as gross sales. There is nothing in the data that tells us how much of the gain in exports generates domestic jobs, because more and more our domestic industries are dependent on imported material and parts. And what we're talking about is aircraft and pharmaceuticals and telecom and semiconductors, all part of deep supply chains, so the things that get exported from the US may have substantial imported components. And when I was looking through the data, I found something very interesting, okay? What I found out was that exports of consumer goods have boomed over the last year. They're up $4.2 billion. And the single biggest contributor to this gain is gem diamonds. Wow. You know, we don't make gem diamonds, okay? You know, we know that for a fact that a big chunk of that is of the value of those diamonds, in fact, were imported. We don't know how much because the statistics don't let us tell, but you have to keep, when you see exports, you don't really know what's the U.S. and what's the import component. Keep that in mind. Second, what we don't know. We do not know the real growth in productivity. I, for one, am quite skeptical about that 6% gain for a variety of reasons, most of which I won't go into here, but let me just explain to you one of them. This came at the same time when the U.S. Companies were cutting engineers. They were cutting engineers like mad. Well, as it turns out, if you believe that these engineers are engaged in product development is not counted as part of GDP. Therefore, I can cut an engineer. I can cut 10 engineers. Hell, I can cut 100,000 engineers. Okay? And in the end, that drives down employment, but it does nothing to measure GDP. It does, however, affect the competitiveness of the U.S. Third point, we don't actually know the real impact of imports on the production of U.S. goods and services and employment. And this is a tricky one, and I'm only going to say 2 sentences on it, but the fact is that you can go and look at the statistics all you want, and there's no place there where they actually measure the difference between the price of imports and the price of the domestic goods that they replace. In fact, the numbers assume that imports have the same price as what they replace. No wonder people keep coming up with that there's no effect on employment. It makes no sense. And then the final point that I want to mention here is the effect of the innovation shortfall on jobs. We don't measure innovation. We don't measure the production of innovations. And it makes it very hard to see what the connection with jobs are. So, summarizing, okay? If you believe the official statistics, what we have is a fundamentally sound economy which has been able to export, which is very productive, which has been hit by a deep cyclical shock, and therefore, when the cyclical shock is over, we'll be back on this high productivity, high export track. The official statistics, however, are not set up to deal with the world as it is today. And therefore, we are running the risk that a crisis will slip up to us while we are looking at the wrong things, just as it slipped up on the regulators in 2007 and 2008 when they kept believing that there was nothing wrong because the numbers that they were looking at were not showing the effect of all the debt building up beneath the surface. And in any case, I hope that I've sort of persuaded you that the bad data can have some not so good effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Lenny?
So I'd just like to make 4 quick observations, and then we can open it up for a discussion. The first one is that as much as we might not like it, this uncertainty is the new normal. So get used to it. We're going to have a period where anyone who tells you they've got clarity and a crystal ball about the direction that the economy is going in the U.S., let alone on a global basis, is lying to you. So get used to uncertainty and volatility. If we, in addition to the list that Michael showed that I raised in October about things that we don't know yet, certainly would add Michael's, we don't really know what the data says fully, and particularly true, we don't understand and collect data on a globally integrated basis that reflects the nature of the global economy. But in addition, as we've witnessed in the last few weeks here, there are at least 2 other uncertainties that are out there that will still be with us for a while. One is, assuming the global economy starts to grow again, what will it affect on materials prices, energy, raw materials, and other traded goods have on inflation, and how do we manage through a transition of ensuring that we don't have runaway inflation at the same time? And the second one, this is as we're obviously witnessing in Europe right now, we still have not solved the global imbalances, and we don't have a global economic system that's aligned with our global political system. And what we're seeing through this crisis is the first real tension of the transition to a global economy, which is my second point, which is that we are at the same time a globally coupled and a globally decoupled economy. Major portions of the world are already well along their way into a globally integrated system. The financial markets are largely global. Much of the commodity markets are global. The high ends and the low ends of the labor market are increasingly global. The vast bulk of the middle employment labor markets are not, because they're in services that are both not traded and not globally exposed. Monetary policy is increasingly globally integrated. Fiscal policy is not. And in fact, even within the EU, they can't get alignment around what is it that they really want. So we've got a global economy that's still sorting its way through this transition, and we in fact have very different situations depending on what part of the world we're talking about. If you go to Sao Paulo, people say, what crisis? We've been booming before, we're still in great shapes. Our banks understood that we had hyperinflation, we had to manage through this for a very long time, and their economy's doing fine, thank you. China and India had a hiccup but are still growing, although the question around what's really going on in China makes US statistics look clean and clear. Europe, particularly continental Europe, has been troubled for a while, and the cracks and creases that were evidenced in Greece only make that more apparent. Eastern Europe and Russia have their own challenges. Japan never recovered from the 80s, and what's going on in the US. We have very different situations about the strength of where people were before, how they've come through the recovery, and what the outlook is. So we're not in one global picture, but that if there is one global picture, it's uncertainty. So what do I think about the scenarios? And it's not unbounded uncertainty. We've been asking global executives for over 2 years now, what do they think the shape of the recovery is going to look like? And it's grossly simplified, but I give you 4 different scenarios that look like symbols, many of which you've heard. Is it a V? Is it a U? Is it an L? Or is it a square root, where we have some recovery but then a flat line after that? What's happened in the last 6 months is that the global executives who are often making investment decisions based on best available data that they see have increased their optimism. Those who think that we're either in a V, even if it's a shaky V, are now at 25% of the global executive base, up 6% since November. Those who think it's a U are at 42%, up 5% from November. So on average, between those two, almost 2/3 of executives believe, up by 10%, that we are on the verge or in a recovery, albeit not necessarily complete. Those who believe that we're an L are still at 1/4 of the world, down 9% from 6 months ago. And those who believe that we're in a square root where we may get some recovery, but we're going to flatline after that, are only at 8%, down 2%. So we're still, the bottom line of all that is that there is not agreement about where it's going to go. Optimism has increased, but even those who are highly confident in their beliefs are still the minority of what the overall probabilities are. So betting on any individual scenario is not a good bet. So if I were you, I'd think about this as uncertainty and hedge your bets about the way the world's going to go. So what does that all mean for the US, and what are we seeing here? The first is, partly from the statistics, but more importantly from what we're seeing on the ground with businesses, the private sector is in fact recovering. The productivity numbers are not sustainable. Productivity growth rates at 6 or 7 or 8% in the United States are not sustainable. That said, part of what's happened, and you're witnessing the enormous resiliency and performance of US private sector, particularly in those sectors that were subject to global economic pressure or those that were under severe financial pressure, which, by the way, between those two is the vast bulk of the private sector. And so what you've seen is a real and sustained productivity growth in the US, driven by effectively reorganizing how work is done. That's the good news. There's another portion of that good news, which is that the largest component of business investment in the United States is information technology. And if you don't invest in information technology for 2 or 3 years, we're not even at the current replacement levels of what the technology is depreciating. So you will see business investment just because they have to, let alone keeping up and going forward. The bad news, a lot of that productivity improvement is part of why we're having a jobless recovery. They are, in fact, doing what they should be doing to maximize their returns, but it means they found they had a lot of slack in their system, and are unlikely, given the uncertainty that I mentioned, to be able to very rapidly return to hiring. That's particularly acute in sectors that have big regulatory uncertainty, which is my final point. Part of what this uncertainty is driven by is that we have an enormous mess in the public sector around the world and in the United States. It's very difficult for executives to make long-term investment decisions when there's an enormous risk in the markets overall, but there's even more policy and political risk. And so to try and understand how to make 25-year bets when you don't know what the outcome of an energy policy, a financial regulatory policy, or what's going to happen really to the drag that's going on in the economy with a large portion of the publicly directed investments in healthcare and education creates a real drain on how to think about longer-term investment. So in summary, what I'd say about outlook for the U.S. is we're not immune from the global uncertainty or the transition to a global economy I described. We should be optimistic about the ability of the private sector to work their way through this, but we still have enormous political and policy uncertainty and a need for the same kind of innovation and creativity in the public sector that we had that's helping the private sector work its way through this.
Well, thank you. Our goal sometimes in New America is to raise questions and not provide pat answers. And I'd like to thank our panelists for having done so. We have time for questions and discussion. If you'll please identify yourself and wait until Andrew brings the microphone up. Questions, comments? Yes, right over here.
My name is Noel Perry from California. And my question has to do with productivity. Lenny and Michael appreciated your presentations, and it seemed like maybe, Lenny, you talked about productivity, and Michael, you seemed to question whether the productivity is really true productivity, and I'm wondering whether each of you would take issue with one another, or you would together on...
I can actually help reconcile part of that, okay? I think there's a lot of productivity gains in the global supply chain. And the question is, how much of that is in the US, and how much of that is in the rest of the supply chain? Because a lot of the companies that Lenny talks to are companies that have global supply chains, and they're kind of giving you a global supply chain view, and there's no doubt that there's been a global productivity improvement, okay, of enormous proportion. The question, though, is whether or not we in the US have really seen as big a gain as the numbers show, or are we miscounting part of the productivity improvements in the rest of the supply chain, which could go from as simple as offshoring to as complicated as genuine improvements, okay, as ours. Now, in some sense, that doesn't make a difference because it still shows up as cheaper prices here, but it does have an effect on labor and labor returns. So without putting words into Lenny's mouth, he and I could have a very illuminating discussion about this question without disagreeing with each other, but just kind of this, you should think of this as triangulating the issue.
Lenny?
No, I would agree with that. There are measurement issues that have to do with where the productivity gains show up. There are also measurement issues about what is productivity. So particularly in government services or in goods that don't have prices trading on the open market, education and some elements of healthcare, we don't measure those very well at all. What we do measure does show productivity improvements, but as Michael said, that doesn't mean that results in labor income growth or employment in the US. What it's resulting in is corporate profits increasing, much of which is happening on the multinationals who are improving their overall global economic performance.
And I think if there's one lesson to take away from this, is that if you start thinking about it, supply chains as your kind of your primary unit, which are not located in one country, it hurts your head to think about it because we're not trained to think that way. But it really is the right way to think, and it actually gets you to the question of a slightly different question, which is, okay, let's suppose we're having productivity gains in the supply chain. Who is getting the benefits of that? And that becomes the interesting question, because it has a lot to do with whether or not, where you're investing in people, where you're investing in technology, where the flexibility is, and who has the hammer. Big questions. They're not on the horizon, but they're the real ones.
Cheryl?
There's one further major ripple effect of what Lenny and Michael are saying that relates directly to the crisis that we've just been through. The paradox of productive improvements is that it raises the economy's potential, but it also contributes to a big gap between the productive capacity and the underlying incomes and consumption. That gap was filled for the last 20 years or so, or particularly the last 15 years when productivity began to increase, partly because of the global supply chain, was filled by debt, consumer, financial, and now government debt. Now we're reaping the consequences of the paradox of what we called in our initial report in the Economic Growth Program, the paradox of abundance, meaning rapid productivity gains because of technological innovation and also because of the reorganization of work globally, created a challenge that we didn't respond to, which was a huge gap in consumptions and incomes.
Other questions or comments? Yes, right here.
Atul Gawande from Boston. I'm in medicine, and it's hard for me to envision what productivity really means, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what work reorganization really looks like. I'm in education and in healthcare, neither of which has had significant productivity improvements from what we've seen for the last couple of decades. But even imagining a construction project or other things, you described as being technology, meaning somehow one person can do more than they used to, and then global supply chains, and I don't know how that translates into that actual increase in productivity. What has it meant?
Can I actually just talk about healthcare for a second? Okay, and productivity in healthcare, all right? What I would consider to be productivity in healthcare is something that nobody ever measures, which is the improved outcomes per person working in healthcare, okay? Now, and as soon as you say that, you sort of realize the difficulty that that's the right measure, but that's the difficulty of measuring it. If I go and look at the change in death rates, which could be one outcome of the healthcare system over the last 10 years, you see very little change while we've added a lot of people. And I would argue that healthcare has become unproductive in the most fundamental sense, which is that we've added people, but it actually doesn't do what we expect it to do. So that's kind of, and I'm a little bit quirky on that because I actually want to see outcome changes. The same thing in education, but part of the reason why we don't measure that is because it's presumed to be difficult. But in the end, we have to actually measure we have to decide what we mean by outcomes, and then go out and measure it so that we know whether, in fact, we're getting something improved. And as far as I know, we're not doing that on healthcare, and there's tremendous debate about whether or not we want to do that on education or not. And compared to that, it's actually easier to measure productivity in almost anything else if you're thinking globally, not if you're thinking nationally.
So can I add to that to extend Michael's concern about the data doesn't tell you what we want? It turns out in the United States, the way we measure public sector productivity is outputs equal inputs. And so it's definitionally cannot have any productivity gain, which is just ridiculous, obviously. But if you actually got to the measurement that you'd want, which I completely agree with Michael, which is real value for input, you'd have to have something fundamentally different than how we normally think about it, because both healthcare and education and much of the public sector is viewed that they're subject to Baumol's disease. The only way to increase productivity is to put more people into it. And therefore, you want to raise productivity measured that way, increase class sizes, or decrease the number of nurses and doctors per patient. Well, that's the wrong way to think about it. What we should be thinking about is outcomes per inputs. And it actually turns out that if you look at each of those sectors, healthcare, education, and traditional public service delivery, that not only when you get at it, if you actually measure it, have had no or negative productivity increases, they have an enormous dispersion of productivity, which is the function of an unmanaged system or misaligned incentives. So those sectors need dramatic productivity improvement. We could start with measuring it and measuring it right, but there are big drags on the economy, and it's something, if we're going to have fundamental growth, we can't have that large a portion of the economy not improving its productivity.
Well, on that point, if you're shedding labor from the more capital-intensive sector, presumably it's going to more labor-intensive sectors. And Mike, maybe you'd like to comment about this, or the other two panelists. Much of the growth in the last decade is in health, ed, and gov, right?
Yeah, I don't think that has to do with being labor-intensive or capital-intensive. I think that if you look at the last business cycle, which ran from the early 2001 to the end of 2007, what you see is that 3/4 of the job growth was three-quarters of the private sector job growth was in private sector health and education. Only 1/4 was in the rest of the economy. And my view on this, and I think is quite closely in line with Cheryl's, is that what happened, that this crisis that we're in has been years and years in the making, and really the government has been propping up the labor market. These are sectors that have heavy government funding, okay? And the reason why we got such big gains in healthcare and education is because the government was basically propping up these private sectors. Part of what people talk about when they talk about a healthcare crisis is that it becomes harder and harder for the government to find the funds to do that.
We have time for a couple more questions. I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions in a row and then have our panelists answer them. Yes, Tim Wu.
Hi there. Is this on? Yeah. My name's Tim Wu. I'm a Schwartz Fellow and from New York. A number of you talked about innovation and the measurement of innovation, which is an interesting problem. And I'm interested in the panel has given any thought to this question of how you measure innovation. Often the effect of an innovative industry, we have Craigslist here and representatives from Google, is they put another industry out of business. And so, how do you, Google Maps or Craigslist classified ads, these are obviously innovative technologies, but they end up destroying other industries. And so what you see is what people see visibly is the fail in the other industry, and they don't see the fact that people are all getting to somewhere easier or finding roommates more easily. The way that innovation's traditionally been measured is by looking at the number of patents issued, but a lot of people, legal theorists, think that patents sometimes impede innovation. So I wonder if the panel, if we really believe that America's comparative advantage is innovation, which I think it is there any reasonable way we can measure and figure out how innovative we are?
Okay, measuring innovation. Another question for this lightning round? Over here.
Lightning round. We all get 30 seconds to answer.
It's Wade Rose from Catholic Healthcare West in San Francisco. I'm wondering, Lenny, especially for you, what are the appropriate public policy responses to the issues which have been raised? Is it a question of development of new, changing what we measure, different organizational structures within the federal bureaucracy to pay attention to global financial trends and global economy?
And last question, this side. Anyway, very back.
Hi, Sasha Costanza-Chalk. I'm a Knight Media Policy Fellow from Los Angeles. So you talked about the fundamental problem of the rising productivity, but the falling employment over the long run. So historically, one of the ways that problem was addressed and solved was through organized labor, reducing the work week and raising wages, but in the global supply chain economy, it becomes much more difficult for labor to perform that function anymore. So I wonder if your thoughts on that would also be interesting.
All right, the questions are measuring innovation, policy responses to these problems, and the diminished leverage of labor. Cheryl, you want to start?
Well, let me begin with the last question. I think Michael Mandel did hit on it. And I think there's also some truth to Mike Lynn's initial observation that labor tends, therefore, to move to areas of the non-tradable sector whereby you have reasonable problems of having enormous productivity gains, especially in the short term, and where you have either a corporatist relationship to some degree with healthcare that coincides with some social objective that leads to
informal, both direct and indirect government subsidization. I think it would be best to see this as on the one hand, as a necessary adjustment to maintain adequate employment opportunities, but not a optimal long-term solution, which should be to find ways to continue to expand the economy sufficiently such that there's sufficient demand for labor which will underpin wages and income without, and here we run smack into the problem of a larger global problem, I think, which is that we have too many high savings, high investment economies that are committed to over-investing and overproducing, which forces the United States to unfortunately be the consumer and in some ways job creator of last resort by providing these safety mechanisms for excess labor in the world that results.
Mike?
Yeah, let me speak on the innovation one. I recently wrote an intro economics textbook which had a chapter on innovation. And one of the wonderful things about textbooks that I didn't know before I started it, which is that every term has to have a definition at the back of the book. So I was actually forced to define the word innovation. That was a painful process. So what I came up with basically was that an innovation is something that opens up new opportunities, goods, services, whatever, that didn't exist before. So think about it, if you've taken an economics course, of pushing out the production possibility frontier. It turns out, I did a study of a few months ago about the innovation over the last 10 years. It turned out to be pretty easy when you looked at different areas to decide where the innovations had happened and where they didn't, okay? Without there wasn't a lot of cases where the biggest issue that I had was actually on genetically modified foods, okay? Because there was a case where there had been a lot of commercial penetration and also a lot of debate about why it had happened. But in most areas, it turns out you can sort of look at it and decide whether or not we're talking about technological innovations or business model innovation. You can actually look at it and say, oh yeah, this was an innovation. Oh yeah, it really wasn't happening that fast here. So in the end, I turned out not to sort of worry too much about on a case-by-case basis, on a larger case about whether or not the U.S. has been an innovative country over the last 10 years. I would have to say that we've spent a lot of money, especially in life sciences. And I look at, and I don't know if people have sort of seen this week's cover of Newsweek about why don't we have more cures. That really kind of sums it up, is that the area that we invest a lot of money in, which was life sciences and innovation, we didn't get a lot of gain in.
So let me try and answer your question, Wade, and I'll start with the answer that today's the problem statement, tomorrow's the answer space, so wait till tomorrow and make sure you come. But let me take one crack that tries to integrate where I think the real challenge is, which is we need a non-traded service sector productivity revolution in this country. And we particularly need it in healthcare, education, and the public sector more generally. Those three elements are the largest portion of where the growth has come from. They're the largest portion of jobs. And they're actually the place where we're not getting any productivity improvement. They have two other things in common. They're the least technology, particularly information technology intensive sectors of the economy, and they have completely misaligned incentives to get to what Michael was talking about or Atul was suggesting in terms of high quality outcomes per input. All of those sectors are ripe for innovation. They're ripe for innovation that has happened in every other sector of the economy, which is we do get productivity improvement. And so if we're going to really have a resurgence of the U.S. based on innovation and race to the top, rather than trying to compete on a low-wage global economy, we're going to have to do something in a much more aggressive case about each of those sectors. If you take each of them today, the equivalent of, depending on if you got even remotely correct measures, they each have a several $100 billion drag on the U.S. economy relative to either other economies or relative to what the performance of best practice versus average is. If we could do something about that, we'd have the equivalent of 3 stimulus packages in the United States.
Well, thank you. Both this presentation and the slideshows will be accessible at growth.newamerica.net. Please join me in thanking our panelists.